Kajian Pembangunan. Pagi ini saya dimandatkan oleh Pak Budi yang kebetulan sebagai administrator untuk Forum Kajian Pembangunan bertindak selaku moderator untuk mengantarkan diskusi pada hari ini dengan dua pembicara yang sangat kompeten dan sangat prominent di bidangnya. Pertama adalah Profesor Dr. Günther Schulze. I hope my pronunciation is correct. Beliau dari Institut for Allgemein
Never mind.
Dari Universitas Freiburg, yang akan membawakan tentang what determine firm decision to formalize empirical evidence from rural Indonesia. Kemudian kita ada Pak Catur, Prof. Catur, beliau adalah dari UGM yang akan membawakan presentasi mengenai tentang dampak dari kejadian erupsi waktu Merapi kemarin. Saya rasa ini topik yang sangat penting sekali pada hari ini, dan presentasi akan bisa dalam bahasa Inggris dan bahasa Indonesia. Kalau ada pertanyaan, kalau Bapak Ibu tentu boleh langsung. Kalau memang memerlukan bantuan untuk menerjemahkan, saya bersedia untuk membantu. Dan saya persilahkan pada Pak Günther. Nanti Pak Günther juga akan jam 1 harus ada ketemu janji dengan yang lain. Kemungkinan beliau pada saat diskusi nanti akan segera meninggalkan ruangan. So, should I introduce or should I translate into in English? Or just introduce him?
I think I got them.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, Pak Günther. Please feel free for. Our combination is 20 minutes maximum for presentation. Then we have to discuss later on.
Okay.
Okay.
So 20 minutes?
20 minutes. We have now 10:30, so it can be 1 hour for each of you. So it's up to you if you want to spend 20 minutes and then 40 minutes for discussion. It will be okay. And then we can later on back. Okay, time's yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that I can't present the paper in Bahasa Indonesia because I don't speak so well Bahasa Indonesia. So apologies for that. Thank you very much. I'm very happy that I'm here so that I can meet all the people who are doing research on Indonesia, because we are based in Freiburg. We have a research center on Southeast Asian studies there. But of course, the ultimate proof is with you, because you know Indonesia much better than we can. So this is a joint work with Neil McCulloch, who was at the World Bank, and then at OSAID, and then at IDS in Brighton, and now is in OSAID in Jakarta. And one of my former master students, Janina Voss, who's now with the GIZ in Germany. Okay, what are we talking about? Informality, and the question of which firms go formal and which ones don't. So the informal sector is important. I don't really have to explain that to you. You know this probably better than I do. It is very large. Most firms and much employment is in the informal sector. The poor are overrepresented. So if you want to change poverty, you have to look at the informal sector. And informality might come at a cost. That is, no access to government services, possibly no access to credit, no labor laws, no security laws, and probably therefore an impediment to growth, because these people don't have access to services that they otherwise would have. So the relevant questions that we pose in this research is who is formal and who isn't? What's the pattern of formality? One. And then once we figured out who is formal, who is not formal, we want to know what is the calculus? Why do some people go formal and others don't? So what's the reason for it? That is basically our research question. In Indonesia, there is no enforcement of formality. So if firms don't have licenses, they are not punished, and they are maybe not even detected. So that means they are not forced to go formal. if formality, however, is a deliberate decision, then it is endogenous, and therefore we have to look at who wants to be formal and who doesn't. So then, of course, the question is, what are the costs and what are the benefits of formality? And this is what we want to study. Firms that we look at are heterogeneous. So for some, the costs might be larger than the benefits, and for others, it might be just converse. And for which the benefits are larger than the costs of formality, they will go formal, and the other ones will opt to stay informal. So what we want to do here is to look at the black box of formalization and basically open it up and see what the costs and benefits are. So, structure of the talk, very briefly, introduction already over, literature very quickly, then I will familiarize you with the data set that we are using, which is the Rural Investment Climate Survey. Then I will say something about the empirical approach. Then we go into the costs and benefits of formalization, and later I will show you which of the firms went formal and which ones didn't, and then some concluding remarks. All right, literature. There is a little bit more than this, but these are the main papers. Levinson and Maloney in a World Bank working paper in '98 said, formalization is a production factor. You purchase formalization and then it is productive. And only later in the development of the firm, they opt to purchase that particular production factor. Once they've grown into a size and an experience that it actually may pay off for them to purchase that additional one. So they find out that the older firms are more likely to be formal. Jackley and Lee, they have a panel approach, and they find that the formalization rates increase with firm size, but not with age. So there's a different result. The third paper by Stulber, Maloney, and Montes Royas, they look at a regression discontinuity approach. They had in this Latin American country, they had an introduction of one-stop shops which made formalization easier. And so they look at people, at the firm composition before and after this intervention, and they compare the outcomes. And they find that formalized firms, or formality, makes the firms more productive, more capital intensive, and they have more paid labor. McKenzie and Sacco in the Journal of Development Economics as well are those that are most closely related to our approach. They use an instrumental variable approach, and they find out that formalization increases profits for medium-sized firms, but not for small-sized firms and not for large firms. And the idea here is that formalization enables people to write down tax receipts, and therefore firms with whom they trade that need these tax receipts in order to deduct the expenses from the taxes, they will now do business, whereas previously they didn't. And they're saying the large firms already do business with those people. The micro firms will never, because they are too small, but the medium-sized firms, for them, that is really a difference. And so for the medium-sized firms, the benefits exceed the costs. So that's the idea of this paper. Okay, what do? We're using the Rural Investment Climate Survey, fielded in 2006. It has 3 types of questionnaires: household, enterprise, community questionnaires. It's only 6 districts in rural Indonesia. It's around about 150 villages, around about 2,500 micro and small firms, and most of them are micro firms. There are, in this data set, are also some medium-sized and large ones, but we excluded them because we wanted to focus on really micro firms and small firms. So micro firms are 1 to 4 employees, including the owner and manager. Then 1757 household firms, around 600 standalone, so the firm is different from the dwelling. and 146 listed. These tend to be the larger ones. Sector is trading sector, half of it, services, some manufacturing. Manager or owner is 63% male, 37% female. The age of the firm median 6 years, average 9 years. A lot of them are only 1 year old. Okay, business licensing in Indonesia, very quickly, because you probably know this much better than I do. So what does a firm have to have formally? First, a deed within notariat, then a tax identification number, then physical licenses for building license, construction license. Then depending on the sector they are in, they need to have a trade license or an industrial registration. And after that, they get the business registration, which everyone has to have. So in principle, you have to have 2 to 5 licenses and the tax identification number. Problem is, that's not happening. Some people in the trade sector have an industrial registration, but more often firms in the service sector and in the manufacturing have a trade license, which they don't need to. Most people don't have a business registration. And when you ask them, and this survey asks them, then they say, most of them say it's not necessary. So there's a whole deal of confusion about these micro and small enterprises, which license they need to get. Only 2% are really fully licensed. About a quarter have at least one license. Whether this is exactly the license that they need to have is a whole different matter, but they have at least, they went to the district office and got a license. So our definition of formality, and there are quite a few around there in the literature, our definition is, let's take those firms that at least have some license, regardless whether this is the license they should have or whether this is the most important one, but they had dealings with the district office. They went there, they got formalized in some sense. That is one definition that's not beyond criticism, but that's ours. Okay, cost-benefit approach. Firms decide to get licensed if benefits are larger than the costs. Average cost 550,000 rupiah, takes on average 11 days. The benefits, that's the black box. That's what we want to look at. The question is, do you pay more or less taxes? Do you pay more or less bribes? And typically, the idea in the literature is, once you get formalized, you are on the radar screen of the government, so they will come to you and tax you. And they will come maybe to you and ask for bribes, right? So that's the typical idea in the literature. So people want to stay under the radar screen, not getting formalized because they don't want to be hassled by the government. And once they grow in size, then they have to go through the process and then they have to pay taxes and bribes. We want to find out whether this is true in our context. And our context, again, is rural, non-farm, micro and small enterprises. So it's not farms, but it's in rural areas in 6 districts in Indonesia. The question also is access to credit, access to government contract, is that any different? Because in many countries you need to be formalized in order to get a formal credit from the banking system. And then the question is, do these benefits depend on firm characteristics, making it more advantageous for some type of firms to get formal and for other types the costs are larger than the benefits and therefore they don't go formal, and we can actually identify that. Okay, stylized facts are very, very simple. Licensed firms are larger, older, pay more taxes, more bribes, have better access to credit and sell more to the government. This is what you see here. That's only descriptive statistics, right? There's no causality whatsoever. So if you look at taxes, if you look at other levies, and we know what that stands for, or we have an idea what that stands for, if we look at the mean percentage of their sales to go to the government, and if we look at access to credit, that all seems to support the notion that, you purchase formality in order to have benefits. And they are bigger in terms of number of employees, in terms of total sales, and they are older too. But that doesn't establish causality. The problem is endogeneity. Do I get formalized, and as a consequence of formalization I have to pay taxes and bribes? Or could it be just the other way around, that if I'm formalized, I have to pay less taxes. And because if I'm paying a lot of taxes to begin with, then the tax reduction function of the formalization actually might pay off. Or put it differently. So do firms pay higher taxes due to the license, or do high taxpayers decide to get a license in order to reduce the tax burden? So the correlation doesn't say anything about the causality here. So what do? We're using an IV approach, instrumental variable approach, and we are trying to establish causality. So what we do is, and we looked for a long time, and we can discuss that later. So I'm very brief now, but we can talk about this more. We looked community averages of licensing as an instrument for a special firm being licensed or not. And we tried a whole set of other things, but that was the instrument that worked best. And then we interacted with firm characteristics in order to see whether licensing has a differential impact on different kinds of firms. So in order to find out what is the reason why some get formalized and others don't. Okay, well, let me skip that, except for the last one. Well, I'll skip it. Let us jump directly to the results since we are a little bit pressed in time. So this is the first thing here. The first column is OLS, and the second one is, and the third one are two-stage least square, and you get the second stage only. The first stage I didn't report here. So let's look at the first row. If you run simple OLS, then you find out that being licensed is highly significant and increases your taxes. So it's, you know, it's significant at the 1% level. So it's very clear that the high tax-paying firms are also those that tend to be licensed. But it doesn't establish causality. If we use an instrumental variable approach and we use the community averages as instrument for the formality status, then you find that the sign changes, and it's again highly significant. So that means controlling for endogeneity, those firms that have been licensed pay less taxes. So taxes are reduced for those firms that are licensed. But it is the high taxpayers that tend to get licensed. So in the end, what this tells us is that, maybe I'll stop for a moment and link this. Okay, so let me briefly reiterate what we are doing here. So we are looking at around 2,500 small and micro enterprises in non-farm enterprises in rural Indonesia in six districts. We are looking at the determinants and the pattern of formalization. Our measure of formalization is that firms have at least one license that they need to have. And the econometric approach is a two-stage least square approach, an instrumental variable approach. And we are looking at the first set of results, so you haven't missed much. And again, the story here is, you see if you do the simple OLS, licensing increase, taxes increase with licensing, but that does not establish causality, that's only correlation. If we use the instrumental variable approach and we instrument for the license, for the status of being licensed through community averages, that's our instrument that we use, then we find that formality actually reduces tax payments. And therefore the story of column 1 and column 2 are consistent. So it is the high taxpayers that get licensed, but once they get a license, they have to pay less taxes than they otherwise would. And therefore, for them it makes sense to get licensed, and not for the ones that don't pay a lot of taxes, because there they don't just go through the whole hassle. Okay. And then we do the interaction with a variable for size, and the variable for size is Q sales, that is the quintile of sales of these firms. So we have ordered the firms in 5 quintiles. The left out category is the first quintile, the smallest firms, and then you have the interaction of the formality status with the quintile of sales, that's the size if you want, of the firms. And what you find here is that the licensing as such affects taxes negatively, but the larger the firms are, the lower this whole effect becomes. So who really saves lots on taxes are the small firms. Okay, and then you find a couple of other things. Let me point out just a little bit. Int ethn means that is the indigenous ethnicity. So that means that is someone, a firm that is owned or managed by an individual that belongs to the ethnicity in that particular village, the majority ethnicity. And they have to pay less taxes. So that is sort of, if you want, evidence of some discrimination. Muslim owners, we just plugged all these things in and didn't really look for it, right? But just controlled for it. But that came out, so let me point it out to you. Muslim owners or managers pay less taxes than other religions. And this is interesting. This is the village tax average. So we controlled also for how much you pay in taxes in the village average. You know, it could be different factors that affected the tax payment in addition to all the factors that we looked at. For example, it could be more easily accessible for the tax collector, so he might go there more often. Then all the firms in the village would pay more taxes. Or it might be a more favorable business environment. Or the tax collector that goes to that particular village is maybe more lenient or more strict or all that. So we need to control for that, and we do that through taking the average of the villages, the village tax payments. And to be very precise, we take all the firms except for the firm we look at, and then look at their average village taxes and controls for that. So that is sort of a business and regulatory environment variable that captures all these environmental factors. Okay, this is the first exercise. The second exercise, and this is the results very briefly summed up. Licensed firms pay less taxes. The effect is smaller for large firms. It is stronger for rural firms, which I haven't shown. These are all rural firms, but some are more rural than others, meaning that the BPS categorizes some as rural and some as urban, which is sort of peri-urban. There's some evidence for discrimination, and we control for size of firms and for village effects. So this is informal payments. And here, a lot of firms don't report not to have paid any levies at all. Maybe they misreport, maybe they don't. So what we're doing here, very briefly, is a Heckman selection model. So we are looking at, and let's first take the simple OLS, right? So no instrumentation. So that's this column number 1 and 2. 2 is the incidence. Did firms pay taxes, yes or no? And you can see licensed firms, oh, not taxes, sorry, bribes, informal payments. And you can see that the formal firms don't pay more or less taxes than the informal ones, at least it's not statistically significant. And the first column is the amount. If they pay taxes, do they pay taxes do they pay more informal payments than other firms that are not licensed? And you can see in column 1 and 2, there is no statistically significant effect. So licensed and not licensed firms pay the same amount, pay as often as non-licensed firms, and they pay the same amount, basically. But this is only not being licensed. If we are looking at instrumentation, sorry, this is simple OLS. This is not an instrument. The licensing or formality status is not instrumented for. If we do use the instrument for that, so we are using the instrumental variable strategy, then you have to look at column 3 and 4. And then you see that licensed firms are less likely to pay informal payments This is the fourth column. And if they pay less. So again, the story here is that licensing reduces your expected payments rather than increases it. So again, the story is different from conventional wisdom where you say, well, if you get formalized, you are on the radar screen, and if you aren't formalized, you are under the radar screen. That clearly is not the case here. And then we interacted licensing with firm size variable, and that's what you find in column 5. So you can see that there is a differential effect. For larger firms, they save on informal payments even more. We have control for a whole lot of other things that we don't report here. It's just in the bottom line. So we have significant size effects. Of course, larger firms pay more. We have significant village effects. So the level of informal payments differs from village to village for whatever reasons. And these turn out significantly as well. What is also quite interesting, okay, I said something about that already. Larger firms benefit more. What is also interesting is this one here. We have a neighborhood effect. So if the manager or owner resides in the village in which the firm is located, then they pay less informal payments. And those out of village pay more. I found that quite interesting. And we have some sort of discrimination that Chinese-owned micro and small enterprises are not more likely to pay informal payments, but if they do, they pay more. And that's controlling for size already, right? Okay, key points. Licensing reduces the probability of paying bribes. It reduces the amount as well. Especially large firms profit from reduction in corruption payments. And then we have all the controls. Right. So that was informal payments, taxes, now total revenue, and I'm going through this very quickly. What we find is licensed, again, OS, licensed firms are those that tend to sell more. We don't have, if we instrument for it, that's column number 2, we don't have any significant effect anymore. If we interacted with some size variable, and here we have quartiles for employees, then we see that there is a differential effect. Large firms gain, but on average, the average gain is not there. So it's only the large firms that gain here. And then that's what we would expect, right? Better educated managers, owners sell more. So that's reassuring for all those of you and us who teach. It does make a difference. Firm size, of course, larger firms that have more employees will sell more, and the older firms sell more as well. Again, that's a correlation, not a causality. Okay. Overall effect, no effect of formalization on revenue. Here we're looking at micro enterprises mostly, so 1 to 4 people. Large firms will gain from formalization, and large firms are those that have four people. And we do the usual control things. All these here, now factor input of course is endogenous, so, and firm ages as well, so that's not a causality. Okay, further results that I don't report in detail. Access to credit, we don't really find anything, but a lot of these firms don't have any access to credit anyways. Access to government contracts, very few of our firms, again, these are micro firms, have dealings with the government. For those that do have, the large firms profit from licensing, but there's no overall effect. So then we looked at what are the characteristics that influence costs and benefits, and from that we did a simple probit model. We wanted to know who got formal and who didn't. So at what did we look at? The sales of a firm, the employment of a firm, the fixed assets, whether they were rural or urban, and then we controlled for whether the manager is male or female, whether it's the majority ethnicity, and the manager belongs to the majority ethnicity. We controlled for religion, and we looked at the Chinese Indonesians in particular. And what's the result? Running a simple profit model, and the endogenous is being formal or not being formal, we find the following. Large firms are more likely to be formal, especially in the highest quintile. Chinese are likely to be more formal by a third. Better educated owners are more likely to be formal. It doesn't make sense also, right? Because it's easier for them to actually be formalized. If you can read and write, then your government dealings with the government might be easier. Less likely, members of the majority ethnicity by around 10%. Owners who do live in the village by around 15%. And rural firms. Cost differences in terms of time and money doesn't really matter. So what do we make out of this? The major reasons for firms to go formal, and formality is defined as having at least one license, is to reduce rent extraction. The story we have in the back of our minds, without being able to prove it with the data set that we have here, is that we are thinking that, you know, if someone comes up, a tax collector or whoever wants to elicit bribes, then showing not being able to produce a license will give him or her an additional leverage of extending more rents in terms of taxes or in terms of informal payments. Whether this sounds plausible to you, I would really be very happy to hear your opinions on that. We think that firms that are easier targets have a bigger incentive to get a license. So it's the large firms, the Chinese firms, those with minority ethnicity in terms of the owner or manager, and those where the owner and manager doesn't live in the village in which the micro firm is located. So formality and not informality is the protective device. That's what we think. And that's the story. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Günther. Now, we still have 30 minutes for discussion, open. I invite all of participants want to ask Günther directly, and then please identify yourself. If you cannot ask, I will be happy to assist you. You can speak in Indonesian and then I will translate it into English. So please feel free to ask them.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Andrian. I'm a researcher in Marine and Fisheries Socioeconomic. I want to know how about the scale of rural firm observed in this research. How about the scale of rural firm observed in this research?
The scale of the firms, you mean in terms of sizes, or?
But I mean
employee.
How big the firm?
Yeah. Okay.
But how big the capital of the firm? Is there any difference between Chinese firm and majority ethnic firm by capital? Is that possible that the Chinese firms are bigger than majority ethnic firm? Because you, in your conclusion, Chinese firms are likely to be formal firm than ethnic majority firm.
I don't know off the top of my head whether they are large or not. I mean, these firms are all small firms, right? But in the regression, we do control for firm size. So even if the Chinese were all larger, and I don't know, I would have to look, but even if they were larger, this effect would be captured by the size effect, and we control for employment, for capital, and for sales. So we are looking at the additional effect that Chinese ethnicity or Indonesian Chinese ethnicity would have here. So we think that we controlled for that. What we didn't do, and maybe that's what you're pointing at, is we didn't do the interaction between Chinese and size. So if you are thinking that larger firms pay more, which would be sensible, right? And that's what we find. But large Chinese firms pay even more than compared to small Chinese firms. So that size has a different effect for Chinese firms than it has for all the other firms. Then we don't control for it. But as far as we are looking at the size itself, and the size effect being equal across all ethnicities, that we controlled for. So even if the Chinese firms were larger than the other Indonesian firms, we would have controlled for that already.
Right. Anything else? Kumar?
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, actually. I'm Komara from Urban Studies, University of Indonesia. Your findings are quite interesting in the sense that you already proved that the general view is people getting or engaging in formality because of being informal is less cost as compared with formality, but your finding is on the contrary. It's very interesting. Now, can you, because I'm from Urban Studies, can you explore a bit on the different behavior between rural enterprise and urban enterprise? I don't know whether your data set is, you're using control on urban and rural, but can you explore a bit on the behavior of the such kind of enterprises categorized urban versus rural? Why I'm asking this is, I think the urban area in developing countries is actually supported by informal economies, although we got a lot of formality in urban center or city, but the informal sector is still back or supported quite a lot. When back to the government, looking a lot of informality in the cities, can with certain attitude of the government, city government, to help or treating the informal sectors becoming a kind of friendly to be informal, then both sides, either government and also the enterprises, got benefit in the sense that the city government can get some more revenues, and the informal who's being in formal now become legal or formalize, and not. I think a lot of informal sector is besides afraid of the formal taxation, but also a lot of informal mafioso. Yeah. Sometimes the costs probably getting higher. Yeah. So if we can formalize it, probably yes, certainly can reduce the cost of doing business for informal sector. I don't know from your research whether can goes to that direction or not.
Thank you very much. Probably you know more about this than I do. Let me just reiterate what strange data set we have. We have a data set on non-farm enterprises in rural areas, and we are looking at very small firms. So these are 1 to 2 to 3, maybe 4 people, most of them.
Very small.
So they are really micro enterprise, and then we have 10% that are small enterprise that have less than 20 people. But the big ones we don't have in there. It is all from 6 kabupatens.
Is it coastal kabupaten or is
here? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Oh. These are the ones. And so there is no real urban area. But some of these kabupaten have dwellings that are considered or classified as rural, and others are as urban. And when I first saw the data set, and Neil McCulloch actually, he was at the World Bank and managed the fielding of this data set, so he knows exactly how they did it. The first question I had is, how can you have a rural enterprise survey and then have urban firms in there? That doesn't make sense. And you say, yeah, don't look at it in the sense that they are really urban, but they are sort of urban fringe of it. So they are peri-urban. So we can look at these kinds of firms, but we don't know anything about informal firms in the city. There would be a street vendor, or a street vendor with his wife, or something. That is not in there. So it's really people in the village or in peri-urban areas. But what you were pointing out is what struck me so much. Given that this is the data set that it is, the notion that I had when I started the research, that we have, formal and informal firms and you could kind of separate them, that was a very naive approach on my part. And I understood that's not true. It's not said that these informal firms, as we define it, are sort of out of the government's reach, and the other ones are within the government's reach, but rather, if at all, the other way around. So they are targeted by the government and by all people who try to extract informal payments anyways. And so the question is, do I get a license or don't I get a license? But not, can I fend off the government or can I not fend off the government? The government is there. And all the other people who want informal security payments and all that are there as well. So for me, this research took away a good deal of naivety, and I learned by that my notion of formality was probably totally wrong, at least for this group. So in that sense, that's the lesson that I learned from this. And in that sense, I think that's, if I understand you correctly, pretty much along the lines that you suggested. What about urban informal things? Sorry, we don't know anything. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah, I'm Mustafa from the Asia Foundation. Yeah, the thing that, the finding just struck us on the assumption. We usually assume that give them formalization will make them access more to the credit. They will get more possibility to grow. But in your case, it just said that licensing or formalization is only protective device, right? It's more than protective device rather than tools to grow the business in the case of rural area. What I'm thinking is about the policy thing. Okay, when we see this conclusion that they don't have enough incentive to be formalized, so they would rather tend to stay informal, right? So now in Indonesia, for example, the policy is try to make licensing as simple as possible.
One-stop shop.
A one-stop shop, for example. But again, in this case, the licensing, the simplification of licensing itself will not benefit at all, right? Because the important is how do we reduce the burden of licensing itself. So if there is no licensing, that will be benefit more to the informal sector. Then there is a lot of licenses, but even though we manage it well, because formalization is just not important for them. And the second is, do you assume that the small or the micro business will stay micro forever? So there is no incentive for them to get licenses, because if they want to grow to the bigger scale of business, they will need more formal contract, formal transaction. So is this not is this not like an incentive for them to get license?
Yeah. Maybe I start with the second one. That's a very valid point. What we don't have in this data set, unfortunately, I would love if that was possible to have 2 or 3 rounds of it to see whether the firms grow differently. We have only a cross-section analysis, and that's the data that we have. So in terms of the dynamics, it would be exactly that would be the question that I would like to look at. Whether the firms that grow or that later on grew were the formal ones or the informal ones, and whether formality was a prerequisite or conducive to larger firm growth. I presented this paper at the UGM a couple of days ago, and one of my esteemed colleagues said, yeah, you know, we did the same thing. We did not the same thing, but we had also these surveys, and they said they revealed that some of these firms didn't want to grow. They just deliberately didn't want to grow. And maybe this would be the firms that wouldn't get licensed. And others that had a different attitude would start to get licensed and then grow. With a data set like that, with the one, you know, with a cross-section, we can't find that out. So in terms of policy implications, these implications we can't make. And we refrain from that. It sounds very plausible to me, what you're saying. But given what we have in terms of information, I could not answer it one way or the other. If I had to make a wild guess, I would probably be doing the same thing as you did, arguing that those people, those firms, those micro firms that want to grow from micro to small, maybe even larger, would be those that decide to get licensed. Because it's sort of a different attitude to entrepreneurship, if you want. But of course, you can't. That's hard to find out. And the actual development is impossible to find out in a cross-section analysis. In terms of the one-stop shop, I'm very aware that TAF, for example, promoted that a lot. And I actually visited TAF when Neil McCulloch was still there, and that was one of his agenda, and I guess of all of you guys. Quite independent of this research, it's clear that one-stop shops is a good idea. In terms of this here, it would make it, of course, easier for firms to get licensed, and therefore easier for them to actually have a tax reduction and informal payment reduction. It would be less costly, and therefore it would also, in the context of our research, be a good idea. When it comes to credit, we looked at this data set very meticulously in terms of whether we have access to credit restrictions and so on. Many firms say that they can't have access to credits and that they would have more, would be willing to take out more loans, but they can't. And then we looked at it and tried to find out whether there's a pattern. That was sort of the sister project to this one. And we cut the data set every way possible, but we couldn't find any pattern. So many people were credit constraints, but all kinds of firms basically the same way. There was no logic pattern to that whatsoever. My take on this is that we are looking at very small firms, and they are very much less likely to go through the formal credit mechanisms at all. They might desire it, but they might not use it. And therefore, the fact that we don't see anything here does not mean that there is nothing there, especially in later stages of the development. But for micro firms, probably that's not the largest issue. Maybe the barriers to get a formal credit are much larger than informal loans, borrowing from friends, and so on. There's information on that.
We still have 10 minutes. Anybody want to?
Just want to review, characterize the firm based on the type, like is it whether this is a food firm or small scale industry or something like that. So that, and the level of tax that they pay, whether they are different.
We are controlling for sectors, so we have only the 3 sector classification: trade, services, and manufacturing. And to be honest, I don't know off the top of my head what the results are for the sector dummies, but I could look it up. But we control for that, but we don't go any deeper. So we don't look at whether a Bakso shop pays more taxes than something else, which will be interesting too. But since we have 2,500 firms, we throw out the larger ones, and then we want to control for all the rest. Sometimes maybe the cells then become very, very small. So we decided to go for the classification that was laid out by the questionnaire and just look at trade, services, manufacturing. That might be too broad a categorization, but that was kind of suggested by the questionnaire, and so we used it.
In terms of tax, that's what Chatur asked you?
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't
well, I do know. In 5 minutes I would know, but I have to go back.
Anybody want to express some query or some clarifications? Otherwise, I invite you to give applause to Pak Günther.
Thank you so much.
Okay, next, Pak Chatur Sugianto. Oh, sorry.
You want to sit here?